In Genesis 13, we are looking at the story of Abraham and his nephew Lot. They've moved now from Ur of the Chaldees, which is kind of where Iraq is today, and they've moved to the land of Palestine. And we're picking up the story near the beginning of their time in Palestine. The seven deadly sins are simply a kind of a collective body of wisdom that the church has inherited from the past, naming some of the things that are at the root of the individual misdeeds that we do along the way. And I'm not taking them in any particular order. I don't even know that there is a particular order, but we're starting today with the talk about greed. Genesis 13, beginning at verse 5. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. Abraham was known as Abram at this time, yet it's before God changed his name. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Lot. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and mine, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Well, Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt toward Zoar. This is before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, "Lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south, east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I'm giving it to you." So Abram moved his tents and went to live near the great trees of Mamre, near Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, friends of Jesus, I want to ask you a question this morning. Which would you choose? The fertile river valley or the desert? It doesn't take a lot of imagination, I think, this morning to picture the choice that lay before Abram and Lot that day. To one side of them lay a fertile, wide, open plain. I don't know what would be comparable around here. Maybe some of the low-lying areas that are along the Mumford River or the Blackstone River. But good farming land, rich land that's more or less flat, and that could be easily worked, and your flocks could easily graze there. To the other side lay a desert. And we don't have deserts around here, but you don't have to use your imaginations too much to imagine how difficult it would be to farm or have your sheep wander around all those rocky outcroppings that you find every time you go around a corner here. Which would you choose? Most of us have heard this story before, or at least many of us have, so we probably know what the right answer is. Lot was greedy, Abram was faithful. And so we want to be like Abram and not like Lot, right? But I want you to stand on that hill with the two of them, so to speak, this morning and ask yourself that question. What would I choose? Seriously, would I choose the desert? Why would I do that? Is the fertile river valley always the bad choice, the evil choice? And how can I tell when the fertile ground might be good for my financial security but bad for my soul? Or when the desert might be harder financially but might really save my spiritual health? In our wealthy North American society today, these questions come at us all the time. How much is enough? How can I learn to spot God's redemptive work then that leads me from a soul-killing greed to a life-giving generosity? Well, I want to look to it this morning first of all, at Lot's heart and then later at Abram's to see if we can begin to understand the deadly poison of greed and the gracious gift of a heart that reflects God's generosity toward his creatures. So first of all, Lot. What's going on in Lot's heart? Why does the fertile ground kill his greedy soul? There's a certain level I think we can all understand why he made the choice he did, don't we? The plain of the Jordan is lush and fertile. It has plenty of grass and water for Lot's large herds. The cities of the plain are prosperous. They offer plenty of opportunities for trade and business growth. It's just the right place for him to move. And yes, it was the better land, but hadn't Abram offered him the choice? It wasn't like he was doing something that Abram told him not to do. It all sounds so logical. And it is on a certain level, but the heart question is, what is dictating Lot's decision? One of the things that we see in the text, verses 10 and 11, when Lot's choice is being described, is that it's Lot's thought process that's front and center. Lot looks up. He sees, he chooses for himself. Now, it's not that God is entirely absent from his thoughts. We're told in verse 10 that this reminds him of the garden of the Lord, the Garden of Eden. As he's looking at it, he's thinking to himself something about God's creative ability and God's provision. But the main considerations in his mind, it seems, are what he can get from this, how God is going to give me more when I make this move. In other words, God's primary goal in Lot's mind is to make me wealthy and successful. His goal is comfort and security, and the plains of the Jordan promise the resources to get him there. As Rebecca DeYoung points out in her book on the 7 deadly sins, it's actually, we got it on the cabinet in the fellowship hall there. There's some books related to this theme, but this is one specifically on the 7 deadly sins. Rebecca DeYoung points out, it's incredibly hard for any of us to give up the power to make ourselves comfortable and secure in this world. Isn't it? I don't like to do that. If I have the ability to make my life more comfortable, I'm probably not going to choose the harder option. Now, theologians have traditionally talked about 2 ways in which greed kills our souls. They call them avarice and prodigality. Nice big words. Some of you who like words will appreciate this today. Others of you kind of scratching your heads going, they should use smaller words in theology. But avarice. Avarice is an excessive love of money and the things it can buy. Now, usually we associate this vice with a very wealthy, but any one of us can suffer from avarice. I read a quiz that one wealth manager gave himself to help spot an addiction to money. Did I pick my career based on how much it paid? Must I always buy things on sale? Would I eat more food if someone else were paying for it at the restaurant? Did I fear being taken advantage of financially? Did I react to requests for money with indignation or fear? And I think we hear that list, and there's not any one of those things that some of us have at some point kind of fallen into. Avarice is what keeps us from being generous, from supporting one another's business ventures because we could probably get it cheaper somewhere else. Avarice casts a fearful glance at our nest egg with every purchase. It takes the biblical principle of being financially responsible and blows it out of proportion so that the bottom line becomes the driving principle in our lives. It takes biblical stewardship and raises it to such a level that we're no longer able to see the people beyond it. Now, at the other end of the spectrum of greed is prodigality, as in the story of the prodigal son. Think about prodigality. Generosity is not only opposed to hoarding, which is more the avarice side of things, but it's also opposed to careless, reckless spending on ourselves. Now, most of us, again, probably don't see ourselves in this category, do we? I think most of us probably try to be careful with our funds. But a quick survey of our kitchen appliances or our toolboxes to note how much of our lives are filled with an abundance of possessions should at least cause us to check our hearts on this one. To ask ourselves, what hobbies do I have? What things am I just feel very free investing in? Anyone who's ever lived in an older home knows how much closet space has grown since 1950. And there's a good reminder in that, I think, of the ways our expectations of how much clothing and possessions is sufficient has grown with that closet space over that same period. See, prodigality also keeps us from having generous hearts because it convinces us that we have to hang on to resources in order to have stuff to spend on ourselves. I remember a few years ago, I was in a Target store. And I walked in, they had these big banners hanging from the rafters, and they had pictures of different things that Target sells, all those, whatever had that they wanted to market that week. And the banners said, need, want, need, want, need, want. They were interspersed throughout the store, and there was really no rhyme or reason to why the things on them were a need or a want. But that's what marketing does to us, doesn't it? It takes something and creates a new want in us that then becomes a need. And again, it's not wrong to want an Apple Watch, or my nieces tell me that Lululemon leggings are a thing these days for teenage girls. It's not wrong to want those things. But if you catch yourself saying, you know what, I need that new Apple Watch, now we may need to find ourselves checking our hearts and our motives. So what happens to Lot's heart as he moves down to the fertile river valley? The text tells us that Lot pitched his tents near Sodom. Now, in some ways, it's simply a record of a geographic move. This is where Lot was going. It was where he was going to build his business, and so there he went. He went into the river valley. But what he discovered was that in order to prosper in the valley, he had to throw in his lot with Sodom, and it's not too long after this that we find him actually living in the city. He knew the place's reputation. He knew about the sin of the cities of the plains. 2 Peter 2 actually tells us that Lot was troubled in his righteous heart by the sin that he saw and heard. And yet what he did is to deliberately bring himself and his family there. And that's one of the things that greed can do. We can kind of see and spot from a distance what's happening, but once we get into the middle of it, it just kind of pulls us in like a whirlpool. It colors our ability to make choices based on God's glory rather than our own gain. And what we find is in a few years, in Genesis 19, we're told about how God destroys the cities of the plain. Lot's greed has him so fast in its grip that he's even resisting God's desperate, drastic plan to rescue him, because it would mean leaving all of his treasure and the life that he built on it behind in Sodom. And we may say, well, that's Lot. How foolish of him to do that. But think about the stuff in your own life that you'd have such a hard time letting go. I have to ask myself that question. What has such a grip on me that I have a hard time giving it up? Sentimental value, maybe even. But I got to hang on to it. See, the truth is that all of us should be able to recognize something in us that has this tendency. We may not say the person who dies with the most toys wins, but we've all got something that we want to hang on to because it brings us pleasure and joy in ways that maybe are more than what they should bring us that joy. And so we have to ask ourselves, how can we recognize the work of God's Spirit in growing us and moving our hearts from greed to generosity? And this morning's text can be a helpful one for making us think about the faith that combats greed, because you notice here that one of the things that happens, Abram doesn't do anything especially generous, does he? We're not told that Abram gives away, large portions of his wealth to the poor, or that he's, endowing hospitals or, social institutions or that kind of thing. Abram, yes, he does, I suppose, offer Lot the choice of the land, but there's nothing in the text that suggests that Abram wouldn't have made the same choice Lot did if Abram was the one doing the picking. But what Abram does do in this chapter is to live as an example of trust in God's provision. Even when the present reality doesn't match the promise, Abram is able to live contentedly in the wilderness. He's living in the place of not as much as there could be. And I think that's a hard thing to do. Because when you're in the wilderness, you're always looking for that stuff that could be there but's not. I think that's a human tendency, right? To say, oh, I wish I could have. If I had done this, then I would have this on top of it. And it's much harder to say, you know what, I'm just thankful with what God has given me right now because it's enough. The text gives us a sense of this by portraying God's command to Abram in almost parallel phrases to Lot's look at the land. But where Lot looked, Abram is said in verse 14 to be told by God to look, to have his attention called to it. Where Lot chooses the best land for himself, the whole plain of the Jordan, God promises to give Abram all the land you see. Where Lot pitches his tents near Sodom, Abram, we're told, picks up kind of at God's command and moves to the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, kind of the outskirts of anywhere. In other words, what Lot sees and decides to just kind of take charge of himself Abram trusts God to give. And that's the essence of a change in our hearts from greed to gratitude and generosity. See, this chapter doesn't tell us so much that Abraham did anything differently as how God began to make his heart different than Lot's. Abram is able to let Lot have his choice of the best land because he isn't scared that having the poorer land will hinder him from serving God well. The medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas assumes that most of one's income and possessions are not to be spent on upgrading one's own lifestyle, but to be given away. This is in the 1200s already. There's a challenge back then, apparently. Most of one's possessions are not to be spent on upgrading your lifestyle, but to be given away. That's a pretty challenging word. I think for Christians, or for anyone in our culture today, we kind of resist this sort of thinking. I mean, let me ask you, those of you who are over 30, I'm in that same boat. How much money do you need to save for your kids' or your grandkids' college tuition? How much money do you need to save in order to retire? Now, these are responsible questions on one level, aren't they, right? It's not wrong to ask these kinds of questions. It's a matter of stewardship. They're questions that I wrestle with myself. We've got kids in that category, right? You know, they're going to go to college someday, Lord willing. How much money do we need to have prepared for that? But the challenge is when those questions begin to take over our heart and dominate all of our thinking, so that all we can consider when we look at what God has given is, how much do I have? Is it enough? And it begins to dominate our ability to handle our finances and rob us of generous hearts. And so maybe the question instead is, how much do I want to be able to serve the Lord with what He's given? How can I do that best? Now, what are some practical ways to combat this? So I think the first thing to combat greed is to simply be aware that it's a problem. That deadly sins don't start when I go into a grocery store and I rob them at gunpoint, or when I embezzle money from the organization, from the company I work for. No, greed is a problem that begins in our hearts with little choices we make in everyday matters. And to turn to God with this problem with a repentant heart. But once we do that, we can also look for ways, as Abram did, to remind ourselves that all we have is God's, and that it is His to bless us with as He chooses. Repentance is one. Detachment is really the first thing that Abram does. To step back and to say, you know what? I've got enough. Maybe a part of that is to resolve to live at this year's level of income. Take a Lenten break from consumerism. Stay away from the mall. Maybe even stay away from the extra shopping at the Shaw's Plaza or something like that for stuff that you don't need. Stop browsing on Amazon for things that you don't really need, and tell yourself, you know what, I'll wait till after Easter to buy that. Maybe you'll find that after Easter you didn't need it nearly as much as you thought you did right now. But find ways to detach from this attitude of our society that constantly is telling us, you need more, you have to have more, go get more. And then finally, find ways to cultivate generosity and liberality in your hearts. Perhaps nothing is as meaningful as bringing our challenges with greed into worship. That's what Abraham does in this chapter. At the end of the chapter, we find him making an altar to the Lord. Interesting thing, we didn't read this, but at the very beginning of the chapter, he's also making an altar to the Lord. In other words, this whole thing is set in the context of Abram's worship, his walk with God. Saying, you know what, I can make whatever choices I'm going to make because I'm looking, first of all, to the provision of God. In the Christian faith, this is expressed in the discipline of tithing, giving away a portion of our finances. The Apostle Paul advises early Christians in 1 Corinthians 16. He says, on the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income. In the Old Testament, this is Deuteronomy 14, God's people were instructed to give the first 10% of all they had to the Lord's work and worship. Now, this is important. And it's not important so much because the church needs money to keep the lights on. I mean, that's a practical reality on some level. But that's not really what this is about. It's because it says to our hearts, this discipline of giving away our finances, being intentional about it, says to our hearts that we are not lords of everything in our bank account. And that's true whether you're 8 or 38 or 88. I mean, it's never really too early or too late to start this practice of saying, you know what, how can I be disciplined? How can I be intentional in saying that my things are not mine? They're the Lord's. Do as Paul advises, decide in advance how much you want to give and what causes you want to support. Then give it, not just on the times when you come to church or when the letter comes in the mail, but do it do it on a schedule that you set. Trust God's provision. But on the far side of greed and these practical ideas, there's a deeper goal than just learning to be generous with what God has given us, because God's goal for us is relationship. I know there's a number of grandparents in this building here. I want to ask yourself, grandparents, do you ever really feel that bad about spending money on your grandkids? Some of you are laughing. I see how my parents are. The priorities are different. And I realize the circumstances of life are also different. But you don't have problems spending money on your grandkids or, obviously within reason. I'm like, we're not talking, crazy decisions here in terms of, poor financial health, but just to take the time to do a little bit more, because there's relationship there that you're looking to cultivate. And if you look at our text, you see Abram doing the same thing. He says in verse 8, we can do this, Lot, because we're brothers. He's working out of a relationship where Lot is looking more at financial advantage. And that's what generosity leads to. It leads to relationship. The Heidelberg Catechism in question and answer 111, when it talks about the opposite of stealing, it says, no, what I need to do is to build others up for my neighbor's good. What's legal, what's required is no longer the main category when it comes to generosity. Only in the church, that generosity flows from a relationship with Jesus. Because of his death and resurrection, we have access to God the Father. God gave his Son his most precious possession so that we could live in relationship with him. We are invited, I said that at the beginning of the service, we are invited into worship. We are invited into a place where we can belong, or we can at least learn what belonging starts to look like. How much would you pay for that privilege? Would you spend the money to go out to eat with Jesus once a week? That's what we're trying to say in terms of the way that we manage our personal finances and we live in response to what God has given us. And we try to do that on a church level too. We have what's called ministry share. We say, you know what, of the money that we take in, a certain percentage, between 10 and 15%, I think it is, goes to our denominational ministries. It goes to support church plants, and it goes to support media broadcasts. It goes to support ministry and seminary training and development work around the world. As God moves us to generosity, I would hope that he also increasingly moves us to see the way that our generosity connects us to others, gives us covenant relationships with others around the world in Jesus' name. There's a story told about an evangelist who one time felt like maybe God was calling him to join a commune where everyone owned their property in common. And as he was thinking and praying about this, he felt prompted one day to take his wallet out and start counting the money inside. And he felt like maybe this was really God's intention for him. And so he took it out, and he was going through how much money was in there. And he was conscious of the fact, he came to mind, he felt God saying, it's all yours, God. It really is. Everything is a gift from you. And in that moment, he felt God say to him, well, you know what? If you will accept everything you have as a gift from me, and you're willing to use it as I guide you, then I don't really mind if you carry it around in your woolen pocket. See, the question of greed and generosity is really a question of what we see. Do we see treasure that we have as ours to be shared with God as we feel like it? Or is it God's that we're using as his stewards, as his managers? Jesus' words should make us think, where your treasure is, he says, there your heart will be also. And our prayer in this season and in all of our lives is that God would change our hearts, that he would root out the greed that holds us captive. Give us eyes to see where we can share his blessing with grateful hearts. Let's pray.